While the world watches the Middle East burn, Africa is quietly building the most unexpected electric vehicle revolution on the planet, and the chaos in Iran is making it happen faster. This is not a coincidence. This is strategy. And the man at the center of it is the pioneer behind Uber's Africa electric vehicle pilot, and he just told Bloomberg exactly what is driving demand. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to see Africa's energy future through a completely different lens. Here is what we are covering today. Uber launched an EV pilot program across select African cities. The man leading that charge, the pioneer of that program, has gone on record saying that the Iran conflict is one of the primary forces driving demand for electric vehicles on the African continent. We are going to break down why that is true, what it means for African economies, who the key players are, and why this moment could define Africa's transportation future for the next 50 years. Let us start with some history, because context is everything. Africa has had a complicated and painful relationship with oil. The continent sits on some of the world's most significant oil reserves: Nigeria, Angola, Libya, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and yet for decades, ordinary Africans have paid some of the highest effective fuel costs relative to income anywhere on earth. Why? Because Africa's refining capacity has historically been underdeveloped. Countries like Nigeria, the continent's largest oil producer, have imported refined petroleum products because their own refineries have been either non-functional or operating far below capacity. Africa exports crude oil and imports petrol. Read that again. This structural dependency means that every time there is a geopolitical shock in the Middle East, every time tensions spike in the Strait of Hormuz, every time Iran and its neighbors escalate, global oil prices move, and African consumers feel it immediately at the pump. The Iran conflict is not just a Middle Eastern story. It is an African economic story. And that brings us to right now. Uber's Africa EV pilot pioneer, speaking directly to Bloomberg, made a statement that should be a headline across every African news outlet. He said that the instability created by the Iran conflict is driving demand for electric vehicles in Africa. Think about what that means. A geopolitical conflict thousands of kilometers away is accelerating Africa's electric vehicle adoption. That is how interconnected and how vulnerable African economies remain to external shocks. But here is the pivot. Here is the Pan-African angle that the Western media will not frame for you. This vulnerability is becoming a catalyst. African entrepreneurs, African mobility companies, and African consumers are increasingly saying we cannot keep being held hostage to oil prices set by conflicts we have no part in. Electric vehicles, charged by Africa's own renewable energy sources, solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, represent energy sovereignty. And energy sovereignty is political sovereignty. Uber's pilot program is operating in markets including Kenya and South Africa, two of the continent's most dynamic urban economies. In Nairobi alone, the boda-bodas motorcycle taxi industry, which moves millions of people every single day, is already seeing electric alternatives enter the market aggressively. Companies like Rome Electric, formerly known as Opebus, are building electric motorcycles in Kenya, for Kenyans, using local assembly. This is not a charity project. This is a market responding to real economic pain. When fuel prices spike because of Iran, a boda-bodas rider in Nairobi loses income. When that same rider switches to an electric motorcycle charged by solar power, he becomes immune to Tehran's politics. That is revolutionary. Like this video right now, help more Africans see this story. The algorithm needs your support to push this beyond the mainstream. Hit that like button. Now let us talk about the key players in this story. First, Uber. The global ride-hailing giant has been expanding its Africa presence strategically. The EV pilot is not purely altruistic. Uber sees Africa's 1.4 billion people, its rapidly urbanizing population, and its leapfrog potential as a massive market opportunity. The company that convinced the world to abandon taxis now wants to convince Africa to abandon fossil fuel taxis. Second, the pioneer himself. The Bloomberg report centers on the individual leading Uber's Africa EV effort, a figure navigating between global capital, local infrastructure realities, and geopolitical forces simultaneously. This person understands something that many Western analysts miss, that in Africa, economic decisions are never made in isolation from global politics. The Iran conflict is not background noise in Africa. It is front-page news at the full pump every single morning. Third, the African governments and regulators. Countries like Rwanda, which has positioned itself as a technology-forward nation, are creating EV-friendly policy environments. Kenya has waived import duties on electric vehicles. South Africa, despite its complicated relationship with its fossil fuel industry and its coal workers, is seeing private EV infrastructure investment accelerate. Fourth, and this is critical, the Chinese manufacturers. BYD, BIC, and a growing number of Chinese EV brands are entering African markets at price points that make electric vehicles accessible to middle-class African consumers for the first time. This is not a Western-led story. This is a South-South story. China is supplying the vehicles. Africa's sun is supplying the power. And Africa's entrepreneurs are building the ecosystem. Subscribe right now for honest, Pan-African analysis you will not find on CNN or BBC. We connect the dots that mainstream media leaves disconnected. Now let us zoom out to the Pan-African implications, because this is where it gets truly powerful. The African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, represents a market of over 1.4 billion people and a combined GDP approaching $4 trillion. If African nations can coordinate on EV infrastructure standards, on cross-border charging networks, on shared manufacturing incentives, the continent does not just adopt the electric vehicle revolution. Africa leads it. Consider this. Africa has approximately 60% of the world's cobalt reserves, largely in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Cobalt is essential for lithium-ion batteries. Africa has significant lithium deposits in Zimbabwe, Mali, and Ghana. The raw materials for the electric vehicle battery economy are African. The question has always been whether African nations can move up the value chain from exporting raw materials to manufacturing finished products. The Iran conflict, paradoxically, is accelerating that urgency. Every oil price spike reminds African leaders and African consumers that dependence on fossil fuel imports is a strategic weakness. Every African entrepreneur who builds an EV charging station, every African engineer who assembles an electric motorcycle, every African government that drops import duties on EVs, they are collectively building a wall between Africa and the next geopolitical oil shock. This is Africa beating the global system at its own game. Using the instability that has historically hurt African economies as full pun intended for a clean energy transition that the continent's geography and resources make uniquely possible. So what does all of this mean for Africa's future? In the next decade, we are going to see African cities become genuine laboratories for electric mobility. Not because of Western development aid. Not because of IMF conditions. But because the economics are becoming undeniable. When oil is volatile and sunlight is free, the math eventually wins. The Uber EV pilot, small as it may seem today, is a signal flare. It tells global capital that Africa's EV market is real, it is growing, and it is investable. When Bloomberg covers it, when global investors read it, money follows. And when money follows, infrastructure follows, and when infrastructure follows, adoption accelerates. This is the virtuous cycle Africa needs. And this is critical, African governments and African entrepreneurs must ensure that this revolution is owned by Africa. The minerals must be processed on African soil. The vehicles must be assembled in African factories. The software platforms must have African developers. The profits must circulate in African economies. Because if Africa simply becomes the market for Chinese EVs and Western platforms, we have traded one dependency for another. The goal is not just electric vehicles. The goal is African energy sovereignty. Full stop. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now. Every video we publish is designed to give you the analysis that empowers you to understand Africa's place in the world and its potential to reshape it. Before you go, check out this next video right here, where we break down how African nations are using their mineral wealth to negotiate on equal terms with global superpowers. It connects directly to everything we just discussed, and it will change how you see the continent. The bottom line today is this. The Iran conflict is a reminder that Africa's economic fate cannot remain tied to decisions made in capitals thousands of miles away. Uber's EV pilot pioneer understands this. African entrepreneurs understand this. And increasingly, African consumers are voting with their wallets, choosing electric, choosing local energy, choosing sovereignty. The electric vehicle revolution in Africa is not coming. It is already here. The only question is whether Africa will lead it or follow it. Now comment below, do you think African governments are moving fast enough to capture the EV opportunity? Or are they letting foreign companies take the lead again? Drop your honest opinion. I read every comment. And I will see you in the next one.